I want to thank especially Utopia Film Club, YDSA, and Temple Marxists for all hosting this really great event. Thank you to those organizations. We're going to have a panel discussion. It's going to be moderated by myself. I'll ask a question to each of the panelists. They'll have a chance to answer, and then we'll have a chance for a little bit of discussion after the initial answers. After that period, we'll open it up to the audience for some questions, some comments, and then we'll wrap it up with some last words on those questions and comments by each of our panelists. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for the night. We have Bhaskar Sunkara of Jacobin Magazine and former vice chair of Democratic Socialism of America. And we also have Mr. John Peterson, the editor of Socialist Revolution magazine. So we'll begin the discussion on rather the broadest question, I suppose, of what is socialism? So, Mr. Sunkara, do you want to take that first?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I was expecting no one to be here because of the weather. It took me like a very long time to get here from 30th Street, so sorry to be late. So I would say as simple as this. Socialism is a very broad definition. So I often think of it like a kind of a rectangle and a square thing. I'm older than many of you in this room, so it's been a very long time since I learned this rule. But a square is a rectangle, yes, but not all rectangles are squares. So in the same way, we could say that socialism came out of a workers' movement that went in many different branches. So when someone says, oh, well, Sweden isn't socialism, I would say it doesn't fit my vision of socialism, even Sweden in the mid-'70s. But if someone wants to say that branch of social democracy is a form of socialism, I think that would be the same. I think that would be broadly acceptable. If someone were to say, the Soviet Union was not socialist, I would say, well, no, it is a form of socialism. It's particularly authoritarian. It wasn't a very good form of socialism, but it was a form of socialism. I would say broadly, but not one that I agree with. Otherwise, I think we fall in the trap of the annoying thing the libertarians do, which is say, this isn't capitalism. I believe in capitalism. This isn't capitalism. This is, a corptocracy or whatever they want to say, right? They're constantly inventing kind of terms like that. Fundamentally, socialism, to me, is about extending democracy from the purely formal political sphere, of course, fighting for political rights, extending it into social and economic spheres. We want a world in which life outcomes aren't accidents of birth, where everybody can live in a basic degree of dignity, but most importantly, a world without exploitation of person by person. So fundamentally, that means a world where some people are not destined to submit themselves to the domination of other people in order to survive. So this is the fundamental goal of socialism. It's not the idea of a worker state isn't the goal. The goal is a society in which there's no more classes. There's no bosses and workers. There's just the emancipated people. And what that means in practice and how we get there is up to debate. But I think those broad sketches is kind of my vision of socialism, a world without exploitation and a world without oppression.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm very happy to be here at Temple. Happy to see everybody out tonight in this inclement weather. And I think there's a lot, obviously, that we agree on. And so it's really great to be able to put forward, I would say different views on what socialism is. I think that the question of the kinds of reforms that we want to win, the kind of changes that we want for human society, a life without exploitation, a life of genuine dignity, a world where everybody can reach their full potential. The real question is how can we achieve that? And I would agree that a workers' state isn't necessarily the end goal. But I would argue that you need a workers' state, and the end of the capitalist state, the end of the bourgeois state, as Marxists would call it, in order to begin the process of dismantling classes, the process of dismantling the state itself, the process of getting rid of money, of the withering away of religion, etc. So I would say that socialism actually begins where capitalism ends. A lot of people would, in fact, call Scandinavia socialist, and obviously, as you said, there was some pretty terrific reforms that were won by the labor movement in that part of the world in the post-war period. In the 1970s, the social welfare state was pretty sweet for a lot of people, and yet you still had the domination of the economy by the capitalists, you still had the domination of the state by the capitalists, and you still had a world in which people were being exploited. And so the question is, if we're going to move beyond that, how do we get there? And so I would define socialism as a transitional period, frankly, between capitalism and the stateless, moneyless, religionless world that many people call communism. Obviously, there's also a lot of people that would associate the word communism with Stalinism, with the Soviet Union, and so on. But if you look at the original writings of the scientific socialists, and I think it's important for us as socialists to approach society in a scientific way, to have clear definitions and not have a mishmash of what things may mean. And to clarify that, if you look at that, then socialism, like I said, it's that transitional period between capitalism and a new form of society. So yes, we need reforms within this system. Yes, we fight for reforms within capitalism, but that's not the goal in itself. That's just a means to an end towards raising working class understanding of the need for a socialist revolution. So that's what I would argue.
Thank you. Any further thoughts on what John said, Bhaskar, regarding...
Yeah, I would say that I agree with the vast majority of it, and that I think the goal has to be a socialism after capitalism, not just doses of socialism within it. I would say where I do differentiate it is that, since the subject was brought up, I'm not a communist in my vision of the future, in that I think, in other words, the vision of a withering away of the state is a goal, is an aspiration, is a horizon. I don't see it practically working, just in the sense of, let's say if me and you want to cross a river in a social society, and the primary contradiction, the contradiction of class, has already been overcome. But for a variety of reasons, I want to build a bridge and you want to build a tunnel. How do we mediate our difference? How do we incorporate others into this decision-making thing? How are resources allocated? How are all these things going on? I think a state is still involved. Now, if you are asking me whether I think there'll be a state that'll be mustering a standing army or throwing people into prison for years and years, or doing all of the sorts of things that the state does today, I would say no, absolutely not. But I think that there has to be some sort of way to mediate that difference. And I would just say in general, the reason why we can't just stop at vision, because there's much in our visions that we would agree with each other on. But the reason why socialism and the Marxist variety became the dominant part of the vision of the workers' movement in the late 1800s, because it offered three things. So it offered, one, the critique of the world as it actually is, basically saying capitalism is a system based on exploitation and inequality. So that was the first thing it offered. And to be honest, anarchists and others offered it just as well as socialists. The second thing it offered was a vision of a world after capitalism. So in other words, you have the critique, now you're saying, but it can be better. Because otherwise it's just religion, unless you could actually say it can be better. But that's also something that anarchists and other tendencies in the movement, or even the utopian socialists, were able to offer a vision of a better world. But the third thing was a pathway. How do we get from the really bad present to the better society we want to see? And the dominant parts of the workers' movement offered a vision of the struggle for reforms, but the way in which the struggle for reforms would embolden and empower workers to be able to demand more and to be in a structural position to build something better. And it's that road, it's that transition of how you build power and how you transform power that Marxists of all stripes were able to offer more credibly than others. And I think that's the real point of a contention. What's our vision of how we get from the present that we agree is terrible to the mutually desirable future in which we might have, let's say, 20% disagreement between us, but compared to the rest of society, like 1%, I think that's a real crux of any disagreement we're going to have. It's not going to be over, visions of socialism. I think a lot of these things would just come down to semantics otherwise.
Yeah, that's a good lead into our next question. But the question of the state was brought up, and I think that's a good sort of point of differentiation. And when we're talking about what socialism is, I'm interested briefly, John, in a quick
Yeah, no, the
response
question
on-
of the state, I think that's crucial. Engels, when he talked about the withering away of the state, he said that society, we basically have the administration of things. And I think that by definition, a state implies a class differentiation in society. It implies the presence of exploitation, the existence of oppression. And if as you said, if we get to this point where we're trying to decide whether we have a bridge or a tunnel, and we already have no more classes, then what we'd be talking about is no longer a state in the scientific Marxist definition of what a state is. As you said, no bodies of armed men. That would be
That's
standing
Weberian.
above society. Excuse me?
So that's Weberian, not Marxist, though. But
That's what?
it's an armed bodies of men. That's a Weberian concept of the state, though.
Sure. Okay, but Engels also defined the state as armed bodies of men, as a force standing above society that impose the will of a minority. Because the capitalist class is a small group of people, they need this overwhelming force in order to cow the majority into submission. Obviously, they use other things, not just brute force. They use tradition, they use religion, they use the media, they use everything else to try to keep the social inertia going forward. But I would say that's a big difference. So the workers' state is also transitional, and that's the question: what kind of state do you need when you have a majority of the population now administering things that only need to keep a small minority of people who want to go back to the good old days of capitalism? It's very, very different from the kind of state that we have today. But I do believe, I would argue, that the state as such can eventually wither away when there is no need for compulsion, no need to force anybody to do anything. And I'd be curious, I don't know if we'll have time because there's other stuff, but when you said that the dominant part of the workers' movement, I'd be curious, in the late 1800s, what, who you would argue that was exactly.
So I think there's two different parts of the state question. One in which we would actually agree in that my conception of the state is kind of the instrumental conception of the state today is not a state we could just capture. It has to be transformed radically. It has to be, in the old language, smashed, because it's, the state has a class bias. It's a capitalist state. And I think that's something that differentiates us from a lot of social democrats, even a lot of people who describe themselves as democratic socialists. So I think we agree with the state now. I think and some of what you said is kind of in Lenin's conception of the state and revolution. And his logic was a simple logic, and not in a bad way. It's a simple logic in that, what he was saying was that today, the state is a vehicle of bloody coercion. The worker state won't be, because the state today oversees the exploitation and oppression of the majority, whereas we'll just need the state to control a tiny minority. And I think in theory that made sense, but in practice we needed a more complex view of what does a socialist state actually look like? What does the transition state actually look like? What does socialist jurisprudence look like? Is there such a thing? There was early experiments in thinking along those lines in the early Soviet Union, and partially because they were in the middle of civil war and violence, they weren't able to really flesh it out. But it was our mistake that we haven't really made up for. So I think we need a better sense of what this state and what this different world would look like. And I would actually argue that we need doses of like liberalism, even in our view. In other words, I think we shouldn't tell people that we're starting from year zero. We should say what we don't like and what we like about the current state of things. So, for example, there's a bedrock of individual rights that don't facilitate the exploitation of other people, but just merely say, this is the right of the individual. This is where I'm away from the state, a right to basic freedom of expression and things like that. And I think given the experience of history, we have to be, very, very clear about. That's one reason. I'm not saying you're not presenting it, but in general, I think socialists need a different view about what our actual state would look like and what politics would look like under socialism, especially because I know this isn't the line of your organization, but most socialist organizations throughout its history, most Leninist organizations, have basically adopted the view of a party state, right? They haven't said that socialism is going to be multi-party democracies and things like that. And I think just in the same way as we don't have planter parties today arguing for a return of slavery, you could say that under socialism, we can't have parties advocating for wage labor or so on. But I think we just have to be clear about these things and flesh it out, which obviously we don't have time for today.
Any thoughts on those words by Mr. Sunkara before we move on to the next question, which I think is
I thought that
we're already heading towards, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I thought that was very, very, very good and clarifying. I mean, the idea that the state apparatus can't be taken over ready-made by the working class because the bourgeois state, capitalist state, is a state that's been designed for the rule of a minority or of a majority. So obviously, we agree on that, and Lenin in State and Revolution, obviously he built on what Engels had written and Marx had written in relation to things like the Paris Commune and things like that. But I think, and of course the problem with the Soviet Union is that the Soviet Union was trying to hold out basically for the German Revolution. They were holding out for the world revolution. They never had any intention, Lenin and Trotsky or the Bolsheviks, when they first, the working class took power, of trying to build socialism in one country. That's an aberration that came up later under Stalin. But they did, of course, had to try to, from a very backwards basis, economically, politically, the cultural level of the population, illiteracy, things like that. They had to start from that very backward basis to try to build up ultimately the basic forms of socialism on a backwards material basis. And that's what led to a lot of distortions and problems in that society. As far as liberalism being a part of socialism, I would actually draw a pretty clear line and disagree with that. Liberalism is a form of capitalism. It's liberal democracy is a form of bourgeois rule. It's in fact a form of bourgeois state. I think the main difference between the vision of liberty of Marxists, of revolutionary socialists, and liberals is liberals in favor of equality of property rights, and socialists, revolutionary socialists, we're in favor of equality of life, economic equality, social equality, political equality, and so on. And so absolutely we wouldn't start from year zero. We would start from year 2018 if we succeed in bringing about the socialist revolution by the end of the year. I doubt that's going to happen, but obviously we're going to start with what capitalism leaves us. And of course, a lot of the political gains that were made by liberalism at a time when the capitalist class was a progressive force in history, we will be building on in a sense. But I think that socialism will actually be a very clear break with liberalism. Although, of course, I would agree. Yeah, I'm personally, as a member of the IMT, not in favor of having a one-party rule state like they had in the Soviet Union. All parties that don't take up arms, for example, against the workers' state agree to abide by the majority, just as we are told that we're abiding by the majority under bourgeois democracy today, would be allowed to express their views. If they want to, express, the idea that we should go back to the good old days of capitalism or to plantation slavery, they'd be free politically to do that. But I doubt they'd find many takers, so there'd be no need to repress them politically.
Well, I think just, I know we have to go on, but I think one important point of differentiation is that I don't think that there's such a thing as bourgeois democracy. And I don't think that democracy was a gain of bourgeois revolutions. Because if it was, it'd be a very strange bourgeoisie that gets credit for the thing they fought violently against. From the revolutions of 1848 onward, and to the great surprise of Marx and Engels and the socialists of the day, was that, in fact, the bourgeoisie didn't actually support democratization, didn't actually fight for any of these reforms. Up until 1918, 1919, when British troops were returning from the front, and a lot of them were ready to vote for the Labour Party, a sizable minority of them didn't even have the right to vote, even at that late stage. The fight in Sweden, it was among the more autarkic countries in Europe, just at the level of suffrage. In which full political suffrage wasn't run until well into the 20th century. So I think in all these cases, there wasn't a single time when the vote or something was just given from above. The closest you had to that was in the U.S., where there was white male suffrage earlier on, but that's an unusual state. So I think we should reject the notion of bourgeois democracy, but along with it, reject the notion that the bourgeoisie was ever progressive in a political way. They've learned to cope with democracy. And certainly we live in a capitalist society that has been tempered by democracy, in which democracy has been warped by the inequities of power that's inherent in a capitalist society. We don't live in a truly democratic society like we would want to, but I don't think any of those things came from the bourgeoisie. And when we say that the bourgeoisie was progressive, we only mean that in the sense that as an after effect of all the wealth that was created through capitalist exploitation, through the expansion of markets, that wealth has the productive forces of society, the economies of our societies have gotten more and more wealthy, which has created the possibilities for a different political form on top of it. But we're not talking about changes made in the political sphere, in which case capitalists have never once, in any instance, en masse, supported democratic reforms or democratic movements.
All right. I'm going to move on to the next question now, and we're going to, after we've talked a bit about what socialism is, and take a step towards where we are right now. And the question I'm going to pose, and we'll start with you, John, on this one, is what is the state of the American socialist movement right now?
Well, that's an excellent question, and if I could just take 1 minute to just wrap up that last point,
yeah.
Only to say that by the bourgeoisie being a progressive historical force, I am referring, of course, to the development of the means of production and laying the material foundations for socialism. I would say the bourgeois democracy is definitely a thing. I mean, we're in the city of Philadelphia. We're in the city of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, but it's a question of democracy for who? When I say bourgeois democracy, I mean democracy for the bourgeois. Just like in ancient Athens, not everybody, they call it a democracy, but not everybody had the right to vote. It was only a small minority of people, and in this country, after the Revolution, it was only a small minority of rich white male property owners who had the franchise. But I think that we would consider that a form of democracy where decisions are made. But not very many people get a say in those decisions. Just like today, there's millions of people who are excluded because of because they're felons or whatever. You don't have real, genuine participation, even on the fictive, bourgeois basis. Which leads us to the state of where we are today. I mean, I would say the state of the socialist movement now. I'm more excited than I've ever been in my whole life. I'm sure you agree with where things are now. I mean, the enormous potential that there is for people to really come to grips with what socialism is and what it isn't. There's more self-identified socialists than ever. Poll after poll show that millions of people, by some estimates, a third roughly of the whole population is in favor of this, especially people that are 18 or older, or who are the ones that they're polling. They show that tens of millions of people are in favor of this. And if you look at the younger people, so-called Generation Z, they're even more to the left. But I think what's really interesting is you actually see a lot of elderly folks, retirees, who lived through the Cold War, and even they are open to socialism as an option on this planet, which I think says a lot. But at the same time, I think there's an enormous atomization on the left, enormous lack of clarity, above all politically. I mean, I think that the left sometimes gets a bad rap, and justifiably so, for what appear to be from the outside little turf wars, different sectarian little grouplets all fighting against each other, yelling against each other. But when I talk about what I think is important is political clarity around what we're fighting for. It's not, what particular organizational form or anything like that, but what ideas, what program, what perspective for the socialist transformation of society in our lifetimes are we talking about? So I think that lack of political clarity is one of the key things that we've got to deal with. I would also add that it's not only the state of the socialist movement, but the state of the labor movement today. The labor movement, obviously the working class is the class that has a revolutionary potential to transform society and bring about socialism, and the labor leaders are playing a lamentable role these days. The labor leadership of the main trade unions, the AFL-CIO, and all the big unions, they basically accept capitalism. They accept the bounds of capitalism, and they do everything in their power, frankly, to stop the working class from actually moving in the struggle. The strikes of all the teachers earlier this year that were so inspiring had to take the form more often than not of wildcat strikes because the labor leadership wouldn't give them the go-ahead. When you had just recently the possibility for a strike at UPS among the Teamsters workers, through outright fraud, the Hoffa Junior leadership basically cut across this unleashing of the working class's ability to just shut down production. And that's where the power of the working class lies. Its ability to shut down production and to freeze production in its tracks, to stop the profits from flowing, to stop goods and services from moving around, and show who really actually has their hands on the running of society, which is a very dangerous question if you start realizing, as I'm sure you'd agree, that you don't need capitalists in order to run society. I think, though, that the key problem with the left today, the key problem that the socialist movement is facing, is the question of political independence, and the fact that most socialists, at least I could say at least a lot of the newer socialists these days, there's a lot of people that think that we should go through the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, as I'm sure everybody knows, is a party of slaveholders originally. It's the party of the northern capitalist class. It's not a working class party. It's never been worker friendly. You see over time that the Republicans and the Democrats have sort of switched good cop, bad cop roles and appealed to different layers of the population in order to maintain and bounce off each other, ultimately to continue the domination of the capitalists in this country. But subordinating the interests of the working class, subordinating the interests of socialists to a capitalist party. And it's not just me saying they're a capitalist party. Nancy Pelosi was asked a few months ago, what do you think about moving the Democrats in a socialist direction? She says, we're capitalists. That's just how it is. I mean, if you look at what happened in the recent elections, a number of candidates who identified as socialists have been elected, and yet they've already backtracked on a whole number of progressive things that they said they might be interested in fighting for if they're elected. So I think the question of breaking with the Democrats is really key, and it's a dividing line. The question of class independence. The working class is the majority, so why shouldn't we have a party of our own? I would say that the working class needs not a third party, but a first party. We're the majority. If this is going to be a democracy, then the working class should have its own party, and that party, I think, with a program that would address the needs of working people, of housing, of jobs, of education, of unemployment, et cetera, would very quickly be able to come to power even, just like the last time we had the rise of a revolutionary party in this country. Believe it or not, it was the Republicans, and they were able to go from formation to sitting in the White House within about 6 years.
Yeah. So I would say that my faith in the state of the movement is partially my faith in what ordinary working class Americans are thinking and doing, and it's actually been steps in the right direction in recent years. You're seeing more people than ever supporting Medicare for all. You're seeing progressive moves in the direction of opposition to mass incarceration. You're seeing support for things like jobs guarantees, and no surprise, this support is correlated with unemployment in the places that actually need these things the most. So a majority of people in Mississippi, for example, support a jobs guarantee. Then, of course, there's cause for optimism among our segments of the left. And I mean that broadly, because we were a left of a few thousand people, and now we're a left of around 70,000 people. Socialist left. And that's obviously progress. And I don't mean that, we have a larger self-described, socialist left that we have had in many decades. DSA has 50,000 members. These are things that we shouldn't take for granted, because those of us who remember, I joined DSA around 11 years ago. And my first meeting in New York City, there was 5 people there, 5 people, and it was like a good turnout. And people were very excited that someone under the age of 40 showed up to the meeting. I would keep coming to those meetings, mostly because I would get free food afterwards. But, I would say that the real tension we have is we have these big, kind of complex, not fully formed tendencies of people, and we have the Sanders push. And whatever you think of Bernie Sanders, I'm a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but we have 13 million Americans voting for a self-described, democratic socialist. That means something. It means something that Bernie Sanders can go into even counties that voted for Trump and have people that will go to his town halls and listen to him. And a lot of these counties, as they're getting fed up, they're rejecting Trump. So we could say that we don't like a lot of the Democrats they're voting for, but we should also think that they were given really 2 options on the ballot, and they resoundingly, the Democrats won the popular vote and swung a lot of these districts more in the direction, because people are resoundingly rejecting what Trump's offering, and they're seeing through his deceptions. The things he was promising is not the things he's been delivering. But then I think that we should separate these two things out. We could say that there's a small ideological socialist movement. Then there's this broader movement, this broader current, and they both have issues. But what we want to see is we want to see a merging of the two together. We want to imagine a time when we can think of a workers' movement, we can think of a socialist movement. We're not thinking about two separate things. We're thinking about social movements. We're just imagining one coherent mass in which there's certain divisions of labor, there's certain things going on. But right now, it's the lack of embeddedness in the American movement is really striking, even compared to Europe and other advanced capitalist countries, where the momentum seems to be not in their favor, where they're backtracking. You'll still do a talk, and there'll be people who are just workers there, and it's not, oh, there's these 5 people here and there are workers. They're the people that we managed to, through industrialization or through something else, recruit. No, these are just the people who tend to support socialist politics, who happen to be at socialist meetings. And I think we have a long way to go before we get to that. And I think that should be the real question of embeddedness. And the final thing I'll say on this is just the question of political independence. There used to be a slogan that was said a lot in the Trotskyist movement in particular, but throughout the far left in the 50s and 60s, and it went something like, down with the elephant, down with the ass, let's build a party of the working class, which is nice because it rhymed, and things that rhymed are better. I think we lost that rhetorical flair at some point, So first of all, I agree with the vision of political class independence. And this is something that the left has always strived for. All portions of the left, the great struggles of the 19th century, the struggles of even the construction of the Second International and whatnot, were about creating political independence and creating political independence from liberalism in particular. Both the Lassalleans and the Marxists were fighting for this. The question is, just having a slogan, just having the rhetoric isn't enough. We have to have a much more difficult question of why hasn't this worked? This has been our rhyme for literally 100 years. It's not because we haven't said it enough. Saying something over and over again doesn't actually do anything. It hasn't worked because of a variety of factors. One was the extreme violence of the U.S. state, suppressing the workers' movement in the 1890s, using the force of the U.S. State to scatter the Socialist Party in the 1910s, scatter the IWW, scatter all these movements. There's a variety of other more boring political science, answers. One is that U.S. workers many of them had already had suffrage and already were voting for 2 major parties, and the ballot system was designed to prevent the emergence of third parties. And some of them were just contingent. There were certain moments where we had the opportunity to build an independent party in the 1890s, the 1920s, to some degree in the 1930s and 40s, but those avenues weren't pursued. Partially as a result of the trade union bureaucracy, partially as a result of mistakes by leaders, partially as the result of just trying those things but failing. But the failures weren't just a string of failures; they were cumulative. One failure made it harder to do it the next time, until we end up in our fairly miserable present, where the majority of Americans don't have a party that represents their majority interests. But I think there's a difference between the response to that by some members of the socialist left. The majority response in the American movement has historically been, therefore we have to deal with what we have. We have to go into the Democratic Party and we have to realign the Democratic Party and make it function something like these European labor and social democratic parties have. That was the old strategy. I think there's still portions of DSA and portions of the left that is pursuing that party in certain ways. This is the kind of strategy of the Justice Democrats, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others are associated with. What we're proposing, people around Jacob and others, is something different, which is just simply we are using the Democratic ballot line and we are running as open socialists with our own programs, our own basis of funding, and we're using that bully pulpit to run competitive races that sometimes win and sometimes don't. And we're making socialism relevant to millions of people who never heard of socialism before as a result. Now, is that political class independence or is it not? If I run tomorrow, on a Republican ballot line in a city in a partisan race. And I run as an open socialist. I run with my own source of funding, with my own 10-point program. Am I now a tool of the Republican Party? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem logical to me. I'm not saying these parties are empty vessels to be transformed. I'm saying that we could use propagandistically the ballot lines, and it's actually been working. So this was a theoretical discussion. I used to have this debate with ISOers 3-4 years ago, and I thought both positions were reasonable, and it was a reasonable debate then. I believe this debate has been resolved, and that tactically it's been useful, and tactically it's still been an independent left strategy to connect our disparate, really small working socialist movement with a wider workers' movement.
John, do you think that it's been resolved?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think that's still the key question that needs to be sorted out. I mean, it is true that DSA growing to 50,000 members, I think that's fantastic development. It shows not only are people calling themselves socialists, but they actually actively want to get involved in something. But it is true that it is a very broad, amorphous. When you talk about 95 million people in a poll that sort of say, yeah, I'd be open to socialism, that doesn't mean they've read, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, whatever. Doesn't mean they necessarily have to, as long as they're fighting around a clear program that I would argue has to transcend the bounds of capitalism. But it is a huge step forward. But I was, Bernie Sanders, there's no question about it. He blew things wide open and put socialism on the map in a way that I would argue had never happened in this country before. The last time socialism was that popular was back when Eugene Debs was thrown in jail. Literally 100+ years ago. But I was a little bit surprised. I'm surprised that people that consider themselves socialists still say they support Bernie Sanders after, what ended up happening at the DNC in the city. A lot of people that were here in Philly at that time must have felt what that was like. And this capitulation to Clinton to say, well, this is just the world we live in. What are you going to do? Vote for Hillary? Even if you looked a little bit disgusted as he said it, a lot of people I think realized that that was a dead end, and a lot of people I think will never be going back to the Democratic Party after that. So I think that it's absolutely true. A lot of Republicans can be won to socialist ideas on a class basis. During the 2016 elections, Trump, when he would talk about Hillary, you know what kind of crowds, what kind of comments people would say. But whenever he talked about Sanders, he was very careful not to go after him, because there was kind of a reverent silence around Sanders, because he was talking about things that they need in the Rust Belt: jobs, healthcare, education. So I think that's interesting that on a class basis, both of those parties can be blown apart. It's not going to be just the Democrats, but the Republicans. I like this imagery of W.B. Du Bois, who talking about in a book about John Brown, he talked about how all the different streams of dissatisfaction were streaming inexorably towards what ended up becoming the conflagration of the Civil War. And I think what we're seeing now with this thaw of decades of sort of anti-socialist ideas is the beginnings of those streams, different currents of struggle starting to come together towards what will eventually be a raging river that I think will have the power to smash right through all the dams that capitalism puts up to try to keep it back. And I think that we have to, if we look at history, the consciousness of the working class leaps ahead, very dramatically at certain stages. We can't judge the future by the past, and we can't judge the way people think, 5 years from now from the way people think today. And I think that's important. And so the question of class political independence, I don't see how one can be in favor of it while at the same time saying that we could, run as a Democrat or a Republican, and it doesn't matter. In a country like the United States, where people look at things in a pretty black and white way, I think that if you say vote Democrat because I'm running as a Democrat, and I would never run as a Democrat, but if you say that, you're then responsible for whatever the Democrats do. Maybe not. Look. You mentioned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Look what's happened already since the nomination, or winning the primary to where we are today. And I think a lot of people didn't want to hear it when it was said that, look, if you you work in that party, you're going to be bound by its rules, and that's basically what's happening. So I think that's important. As far as the violence of the capitalist state stopping the working class from forming its own political party, I mean, all capitalist states, all states are violent. I mean, if you look at Tsarist Russia, they weren't able to stop the Russian Revolution from happening. Even in countries like Iran, for example, the Shah's state apparatus wasn't able to stop itself from being overturned at a certain point. And pretty much every country in the so-called advanced capitalist world has a workers' party, or at least at one point did, a mass socialist party, communist party, labor party, etc. Some political vehicle for expressing themselves. They weren't stopped. So I don't think it'd be fair to say that there's a unique American exceptionalism that has prevented that. I would argue, and you kind of alluded to this, that it's by mistakes of the leadership, the mistake of the leadership or the lack of a leadership that understands the need to do that. The fact that several times when there were opportunities to move in that direction, for example, in the 1930s with the rise of the CIO, which was an elemental class struggle taking place in the big new industries that were erupting in all parts of the country, really, you had a new kind of trade unionism, a new workers' movement emerge, and there was the possibility to give that a workers' expression. You have states like Minnesota that did have a farmer labor party that actually had a pretty advanced program and actually pretty advanced conditions for the working class in Minnesota in the 1930s compared to what we have to deal with in the rest of the country today. So I don't think that that's an insuperable obstacle. As far as the structures of the capitalist setup being completely rigged and being undemocratic and really set up for a two-party system, even though there's nothing about that in the Constitution. Again, I think that if there's enough of an elemental upsurge and a will and a way forward pointed by the labor leadership, by the left leadership, then people will start to see that direction. But when you have the labor leadership saying, "Oh no, don't move in that direction," or you have the leaders of the socialist movement saying, "Oh no, don't go in that direction. Let's run maybe as a Republican. Let's run maybe as a Democrat." You're not offering a vision and perspective. And I think if people want to know where to go, they have to be able to see where that might be. And so that's what I would say.
All right, thanks, guys. I think this is, again, we've already started going into this, but the real meat of the discussion tonight, I kind of want to get into that so we have plenty of time to discuss it, which is, not just where we're at now, but what are the goals of the socialist movement? What should the goals of the socialist movement be, I suppose, and how do we get to socialism? And I want to add as a sort of further question, given that we are having a discussion with two panel members who are involved with publications, of what do you see the role of Jacobin and also what do you see the role of socialist revolution being in that movement? And Mr. Sunkara, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I think the immediate goal of socialists, I think, we can say socialist movement if we want, but, it's just, it's not quite a movement yet. But the immediate goal of socialism has to be what I mentioned before, the merger, right? Getting embedded with working class struggles, and that could be at your job, it could be being part of something in your community like a tenants organization, it could be just engaging in these wider struggles that people are taking part of, the struggle for Medicare for all, local election campaigns run by socialists. I mean, these are things where when we engage with these things, we try to raise the level of class consciousness, we try to raise the level of polarization, we try to do things differently, because sometimes the question often becomes, are you for reforms or you're for a revolution? But the more elemental question is, how are you fighting for those things, right? Do you believe that you could get a better deal with Amazon by, cutting, a deal with CEOs, right? Or do you believe that this will happen from actually empowering people on the shop floor to fight back? And fundamentally, the only assumption that I'll admit to whenever I talk with someone who's, anti-Marxist, whatever, I'll say, well, you're assuming that people have this human nature, this human nature. The only assumption that I think we need to have is that people are genuinely rational actors, in that they know, at the very least, when they're getting mistreated, that they know when they're getting exploited, and if given another option, given an option to fight back, they'll take that option. And I think one of the goals of the socialist movement is to create the infrastructure of dissent that will allow more people to take that option and take the option of collective action, of class struggle to fight back. Because right now, most people don't fight back. It's not because they're dumb. It's not because of false consciousness or any of these notions. It's because they're smart. They know that in a country with a weak left, in a country with very low levels of unionization, and where we have unions, where many of them are not great unions, it's much more rational when you're having hard times at work to keep your head down and try to keep a job, right? It's a lot more rational if you're short on rent at the end of the month and you can't pay your rent, instead of going on a rent strike. It's a lot safer and more rational to just try to rely on your kinship networks, try to ask friends and family to help you out that month to move out. That's often more rational than fighting back. And I think the goal of our tiny socialist movement is to try to figure out how can we deploy our resources in such a way that we can create these infrastructure of dissent, which can then mean 50,000 people are making it possible for 5 million people to fight back. And I think that's the primary goal. Now, when I think about reforms, besides for that, yeah, we are fighting for things that you could define as just reforms that the system could accommodate. In other words, our immediate set of demands are reforms that capitalism could possibly allow. We could possibly live in a capitalist society with a living wage. We could possibly live in a capitalist society where there's affordable housing for all. We could possibly live in a capitalist society where people have decent education and aren't thrown into jails at astronomical rates. Our immediate demands are achievable. The thing is, our immediate demands also hit the resistance of people who benefit from the status quo, from people who own and control things. That's why these fights for reforms are so important. And the process of fighting for reforms will build a power that'll start leading us to ask deeper and deeper questions and more radical questions and more fundamentally challenge capital. Now, what Jacobin, I think, has managed to do is, within the left, we managed to talk about class and foreground some of these ideas that seem very not vogue 8 years ago when Jacobin was formed. Everybody wanted to talk about, there was a John Holloway, take the world without taking power. Nobody wanted to talk about trade unions or about the need for political parties. Even something which you said, which is a shared goal of ours, kind of the idea of independent working class political action. I mean, these were things that were so out of sync with even the far left that we were all a tiny minority. And I imagine we're debating now, but if we were in the same room 8 years ago, we might have to, huddle together to protect ourselves against, what was the dominant consensus on the left then. So I think we had that goal within the left. But I think the more significant and important thing is we were able to reach hundreds of thousands of people with a message that they hadn't heard before, which was a basic socialist message that was accessible, that still challenged them. It was still a new way of thinking about things, but it was able to reach people where they were and bring them further to the left. And I think that's the main thing we need to do without becoming kind of just populist or whatever, without dropping our goals, without pretending we're something we're not. Just be able to go to working class people and ask more questions than we're answering. Because chances are people know about their own situation more than we know about their situation. And if you're engaging in these conversations, you're interacting with people, you're working on bigger, wider campaigns, I mean, that's the basis of building a movement. That's the basis of repoliticizing the working class. And we're very far away from that. But I have more faith in ordinary working class people than I do in the far left at most times.
John, the same question.
Yeah, well, I think Marxists have a simple rule of thumb, which is basically anything that raises class consciousness, confidence, and unity, we're in favor of. And if it works against class consciousness, confidence, and unity, then we're against it. Obviously, that's a little bit simplistic, but it's essentially what we look at. And so, for example, the question of the Democratic Party, does that increase the consciousness that working class is an independent class and that it needs to be united? I would say no. So therefore, I mean, that's a pretty simple reason why we should maintain that class independence at all times, because the working class has enormous power. As we said earlier, the working class is the majority. Even nowadays, with a numerically decimated trade union movement, the industries that unionized workers are unionized in have the capacity to shut down this country. I mean, for example, just 30,000+ workers on the West Coast control everything that comes in and off the ships, from China, from Japan, from the whole of Asia, 30,000 people could shut down a big chunk of Amazon and Walmart and all these countries. I mean, that's a lot of power concentrated in very few hands. The problem is that the labor leadership doesn't want to exercise that power. They are always using excuses, oh, the Republicans this or the Democrats that, in order not to exercise that power. And I think that that's one of the key problems that we've got in this country. Again, it comes down to leadership. My goal, the end goal, is ultimately a socialist federation of the Americas as part of a world socialist federation. That may sound a little pie in the sky to people, but I think that if you don't have a clear goal of where you're going and somewhere where you want to go in your own lifetime, I believe that given the huge leaps in consciousness, given the crisis of capitalism that we're living through, that this is possible in the next historical period. 8 years ago, absolutely, it wasn't the same as today, but at the same time, 10 years ago, we went through the biggest crisis in recent memory of the capitalist system, and people already, I would say 8 years ago, were beginning to question things, and that's obviously why Jacobin was able to provide an outlet for people who were looking for ideas in order to try to find some kind of a solution. I'd say that when the next crisis comes, and it is coming, we don't know when or how or whatever, but pretty soon it's going to come. I think statistically, we're getting close to having one of the longest economic booms in U.S. history. What goes up is going to come down under capitalism. It is going to come, and I think that the changes in consciousness are going to be dramatic, and people are going to be way more open than they are even today, not just to socialist ideas in general, but to the idea of a socialist revolution. There is no stability that can be offered by the system. Even the basics, we kept our heads down, as you said. We moved into our parents' house because we couldn't afford the rent. All these individual solutions, people are going to realize there's only collective solutions possible. We are going to have to come together, not just in unions, but also in a political party, and not just at the ballot boxes, but on the streets, in the neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. So I think absolutely reforms, as I said earlier, are important, but they're a means to an end. They're not the end in of itself. And I say that I think a lot of socialists today, somehow, I think they sort of miss the forest for the trees, and they get a little bit caught up in these smaller goals. I think that it is through those struggles for reforms that workers can increase their consciousness, their confidence, and their unity. However, we live in a period of counter-reforms. If any government, especially like in Europe with what's going on now, when they start talking about, we're going to reform the labor movement, it's a reform. We're going to reform healthcare. We're going to reform this or that. That means a counter-reform. We're in a crisis of capitalism. They're pushing things backwards now. In Scandinavia, for example, in the United States, obviously, it's austerity across the board. So I think that that's the future. I mean, even the capitalists themselves had said that they're looking to a future of about 50 years of austerity. What's beyond that? I don't know, but 50 years is a long time, and I can imagine it's only going to get worse after that. So we're not against reforms, but you can't talk about things being possible, a living wage, healthcare, etc. Yeah, it might be possible in the abstract, but things are materially going backwards now. So I think that's got to be our starting point. I think that the point of Socialist Revolution magazine, the role that we want to play, is to help educate people. I think this idea, you talk about how the left can deploy resources now. I think that the capitalist crisis is going to do about 95% of the heavy lifting for us. And when those big leaps in consciousness take place, the question is going to be when people have tested the Republicans, they've tested the Democrats, they've tested different reformist options. When they need a solution that says we need to go beyond the limits of capitalism, there needs to be people, enough of them, and enough important places, workplaces, campuses, neighborhoods, etc., to be able to guide the way forward. So I think Socialist Revolution magazine, we have a program in the back. Obviously, at our website, socialrevolution.org, you can check it out. And that's what we fight for. We fight for that program in the labor movement. We also provide theoretical education, historical analysis, a lot of topics also that Jacobin covers as well. And I think that's important. So I would say, where do we deploy resources? First of all, we have to have the perspective that big changes are coming, big crises are coming, big leaps in consciousness are coming, and knowing that, we need to prepare for it by educating ourselves while also building roots in the working class, in our campuses, in our neighborhoods, and I think the unions especially are particularly important.
So just 1 minute just to address 2 points of difference briefly. One is I share your broad perspective of the labor movement as far as, I believe in the rank and file strategy. They need to challenge trade union bureaucracies, make unions more democratic, and so on. I think you do emphasize too much betrayals and leadership and whatnot, instead of the fact that, structurally it's been a period of retreat for the labor movement all around the world. So if the question becomes purely contingent, like what's in people's head, it doesn't explain why the retreat has been so universal. There's also the broader question of why union bureaucracies are formed in the first place. So there's one view that's kind of like union bureaucrats steal power from workers. I think that's sometimes happened, but often after waves of struggle, workers will cede power to union bureaucrats. In other words, you can't permanently stay mobilized, right? Eventually, people want to go home after work to see their family and do these other things. So you can get people at a hyper level of mobilization for months at a time, but not indefinitely. And I think that's often why bureaucracies are formed. And I just think in general, there's an overemphasis on the labor movement being a break instead of reflecting a broader thing. I think in some cases, like what you mentioned, the Teamsters and what happened in Wisconsin and whatnot, the union bureaucracy was definitely a break. But I think it's a bit, you're overstating a bit slightly. I think the more significant difference is a lot of what you're saying throughout the night has been very contingent on the idea of consciousness. So in other words, these are facts that we don't really have control over. Just basically saying, in time, something else will change, and people's thoughts will change in time because of these conditions that will happen in time. And I don't think that's a political strategy. In other words, I think you're right in certain ways, in that I think that crises are going to accelerate. We could only look at climate change and things like that, and these things are going to provide certain openings for the left. And I think we're seeing some of that, but I don't think that's how you build a political strategy. In that, when I think about building a political strategy, I think, all right, we have to deal with what we have on the ground and try to mold this into something. So that's why I do think the movement around Sanders 2016 mattered. And I do think that if he runs again, there's certain openings. I think that matters. I think the new currents of movements fighting that have emerged and will spread, fighting against climate change, against mass incarceration, for all these things, matter and are part of our strategy. I think the West Virginia teacher strikes and teacher strikes all across the country matter because they're the concrete things on the ground. So the question is, how do you take these forces out to take where we are, and how do you build a political strategy? The final thing I would say about crisis is that capitalism is a system that's prone to crisis, but there's a reason why none of its crises since the very beginning of capitalism has been fatal. Because it's also a system that's prone to stability and readjustments. And at the core of this is because workers are dependent within capitalism on capitalists. And capitalists, of course, are dependent on workers, but it's an asymmetrical dependencies. You need your boss more than any capitalist needs any individual worker. So in a time of crises, sometimes it doesn't encourage mass strikes. At points during the 1930s, at the worst time of the Depression, the worst periods of crisis, you actually had less strikes than you did when the economy was rebounding. Why? Because when labor markets tighten a little bit, then workers see, all right, it's a lot easier to strike when there's 5% unemployment than when there's 15, because there's a chance that we all get fired, that we get jobs the next day. And I think the same even goes for the idea of, why do people vote for the Democratic Party? They're voting because they see two options, and this option is more in their class interest, right? If you're a black or brown working class person, you're voting for the Democratic Party. If you are voting for the Democratic Party, and of course, like a lot of people are alienated from both parties and not voting at all. But if you are voting for the Democratic Party, you are making a class-informed, a class-conscious, decision. And it's one so I think our goal has to be to create the political strategy and create the infrastructure of dissent so there are other options, but not just wait for leaps in consciousness. Because I think you'll find that when the crisis comes, people will act rationally, and often that will be trying to get the lesser evil, because that means less evil in their lives. And if we want them to choose something different, if we want them to choose independent working class political action, we need an actual strategy to do that.
John, your thoughts on political strategy? And
well, no, I agree absolutely. The working class is not going to sacrifice everything and throw everything into the final battle unless they're pretty sure they can win it. But if they don't have confidence in the leaders of that battle, they don't have confidence in their general staff, and if, their leaders have a track record of losing and capitulating and making excuses, they're not likely to do that. And so I do think it comes down ultimately to leadership. I mean, as far as you said that there's some structural reason for the decline in the labor movement or trade unionism on a worldwide scale. I mean, I would say that in the West, okay, fair enough. But I mean, take example of the United States. I mean, if you open the floodgates to defeat, for example, the PATCO strike, which was obviously a major turning point in the American labor movement. It was a strike of air traffic controllers that Ronald Reagan shut down and basically, destroyed the union, fines and arrests. And the rest of the labor movement did not support them. The first rule of trade unionism should be solidarity. It should be an injury to one is an injury to all. And they were allowed, because of the leadership of the rest of the unions, to be hung out to dry because they were so worried about their own positions, their own bureaucratic privileges and so on, that they let that happen. That's a political leadership decision, not a structural reason why there couldn't have been a counteroffensive against that major attack, which has since then marked the high, one of the high points and the low points of the American labor movement. And I agree absolutely. During periods of class upsurge, workers are more engaged in their trade unions, in the organizations that they build in the course of those struggles. When things start going back to normal, they tend to cede that engagement to the professionals. Oh, we'll let the professionals do it. I've got stuff to do. We want to, in the 1950s and 60s, there were regular wage increases without too much struggle, because the capitalist boom of those years of the post-war period allowed for a few more crumbs to go to at least a certain layer of the working class. But now, of course, over time, a bureaucracy gets encrusted at the top, and it's very difficult to dislodge them. I believe, however, that we can't look at the future of the labor movement by looking at the state of the labor movement today. Just as, for example, I said earlier, the CIO emerged out of the conservatism of the AFL. There's going to be new kinds of unionism, or at least new unions. All the service workers, for example, fast food workers unions, things like that, which represent large layers of the population that are going to, I think, breathe new life into a lot of the other unions that still exist and still have enormous power, like I said earlier. As far as consciousness, I mean, consciousness typically is conservative. Consciousness typically lags behind events. Consciousness, people typically want to find something firm and stable, and they want to stick to it, even though it's not entirely pleasant or the best thing they could possibly get. But this system is going to have a series of earthquakes, social earthquakes, economic earthquakes, political earthquakes, that are going to, make people not feel stable and be forced to look for something beyond those bounds. So, it's definitely not about just sitting around waiting for consciousness to change. I certainly don't sort of bow to spontaneity and just expect that when that, automatically something's going to change. Because you're absolutely right. Capitalism, the crises of capitalism are not fatal unless it's pushed over the edge of history consciously. I mean, that's one of the key differences of the socialist revolution versus the bourgeois revolutions of the past, where the socialist revolution has to take place as the result of the conscious action of the working class pushing in that direction. So that's a major difference. However, I would say that because of the belated nature of the socialist revolution, you mentioned climate change. I mean, it is possible that we may not get to socialism unless we rid this planet of capitalism in the next historical period. It's definitely not inevitable, and that's what we've got to prepare for. Those moments, those very brief moments in history, which are called revolutions, when everything is up in the air, when everything is possible, when the old state apparatus no longer has a grip of fear over the masses, when the ruling class doesn't know how to rule anymore, when the middle classes, the small shopkeepers and so on, when they're not sure, they don't trust the ruling class anymore. They're now interested in maybe what the working class has to say because they're worried about being thrown into the ranks of the poor and the unemployed and so on, and that the working class is ready to fight. At those decisive moments, you need people that can, sort of show the way out of that crisis, and that crisis has to go beyond the system. And I know you say that we agree on the need for structural change, but I just don't see how you can do that by limiting yourself to this system. And I think that if you don't start, instead of working with what we've got and saying, well, we've got the Democrats, let's just work with that. That party is rotten. That party, the biggest cities in this country are controlled by the Democratic Party. The LAPD, Chicago, New York, that's the Democratic Party. You talked about if you're a black or brown person. Obama has deported more Latinos than anyone in history. How is that a worker-friendly government?
I've never worked with the Democratic Party or advocated working with the Democratic Party, though. What I said is that it's a rational choice. When people are voting for Democrats, they're not being stupid.
Okay, right? but as someone who has a platform that lots of people, right? A platform that lots of people are looking to, that are feeling an interest in socialism. Don't you feel some responsibility to point them away from this party that represents an alien class instead of saying, well, that's a rational decision, do whatever you want? Or am I mischaracterizing what you're saying? I'm just curious.
Well, first of all, I wish I had that kind of importance. I don't mean that in a joking way.
Bigger audience than Socialist Revolution at present.
Well, I would say this, that we have a duty to engage with people where they're at. And if we can't give them a better option, then I think that telling someone in a swing state not to vote for a Democrat in 2016 doesn't really make sense. I also don't think it makes sense to use the limited resources that we have in our socialist movement to canvass for Democrats in that area. In which case, so I think, in other words, you're portraying kind of an ambivalence there as something deeply cynical. What I'm saying is that I'm not sure what the better option is. I'm not sure whether openly encouraging people, let's say in Pennsylvania, to go out and vote for Jill Stein, which I've done twice, and whatever. Yeah, I've never voted for a Democrat actually in a presidential election. I have voted for Bernie Sanders, but in a primary, but. I just that was my only point. I don't see how that's actually a strategy. It seems like propaganda and rhetoric, and just kind of waiting for changes in consciousness, waiting for conditions, and saying things over and over again until it becomes real. I think I wish I was in a different country where things were more simple, where we already had a workers' party, where we already had a current around socialism, where the question was, how do we take this party, how do we take this movement that we have and actually fight the bosses and win reforms. We are in a very unusual situation in the United States. We're in a situation that's come out of decades of defeat, and that requires, I think, original thinking. It requires strategies that seem like we shouldn't have to do them. We shouldn't have to trot out a 70-something-year-old social democrat and run him on the Democratic Party ballot, but we did, and we made major advances that way, and we're in better condition now because Sanders ran, because people like me canvassed for him and supported him, than we were a few years ago. And I think that in the future, we obviously can't keep replaying the same thing. The strategy has to go somewhere. There's a lot of pitfalls and dangers there. I'm very critical of AOC and a lot of this new wave of candidates. And I'm critical of the trap of electoralism that I think DSA can fall into. But I think that we've been vindicated by the last couple of years, and the vindication isn't just the size of DSA. 50,000 members, who cares? And also, like, joining DSA is important when you're engaged with it at the level of like you're involved with the chapter. There's Philly DSA is great, does a lot of great work, but it doesn't mean anything if you're not engaged with the chapter and you're just paying $60 a year, right? So it's a looser thing. But what I am concerned about is where we go next, how we build class consciousness and struggle. And I think so far some of these things that you're dismissing, and I don't mean that we're dismissing too harshly, but have actually made some gains, and that's something that we have to grapple with. The fact that running a candidate on a Democratic ballot line, did something.
What did it do? And then I'd like to address some other things, but maybe briefly. I don't see what it did.
I think Sanders actually running made it so that after the election there was an alternative for people. An alternative for people who hated Hillary Clinton and what she represented and who she represented, hated Donald Trump and the racism and sexism and everything else that he represented. Because the majority of his voting bloc was not working class and didn't care about the protectionism stuff. Most of his working class were the usual basis of the right, which was petty bourgeois. Most workers just didn't vote, right? They just decided, they didn't want to go with either candidate. But having Sanders there meant that there was a third alternative for people. There was something where they said, if only we had this, right? And around that, we've been able to build new currents around Medicare for all. We've been able to fight at the local level for housing rights. And you're seeing the battle for rent control, for justice there is spreading. You're seeing millions of people actually get engaged with these ideas. You're seeing people even do things like Google, what is socialism, right? I think DSA got around 10,000 members that way. And I think that does mean something. And and we both, I think, been on the socialist left for long enough to remember the very lean years. And I'm not sure if that Sanders is just the accident that's getting the attention because there was this deeper shift in consciousness happening. Obviously, there was that happening too, but I think he actually did something, and the movement around him did something.
John, I'd like for you to finish your thoughts that you had started before, and I'd also like to maybe have a couple wrap-up comments before we can move it to questions from each of you, and then we could address the questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. There's no question. I think Sanders tapped into a deep-seated discontent, but he also, by the boldness of what he said, I mean, he talked about a political revolution against the billionaire class and stuff like that, socialism, words that hadn't been said in the United States for a long time, if ever. There's no doubt that he played an important role in that. But I also think that he could have used the mass interest that he had. I mean, what is it, 30 million people that voted for him in the primaries, people that were dissatisfied. And a lot of people there in the primaries didn't vote for him, especially early on, precisely because they thought he couldn't win. And that's why they held their noses and voted for Clinton anyway. I think he could have launched an independent campaign, and he very well could have defeated both Clinton and Trump. And if he hadn't, at the very least, could have laid the foundations for something for the midterms, for something for 2020. I mean, remember, Abraham Lincoln was elected in a multi-way race with just 39% of the vote. It's not ruled out that he actually could have won. So, he didn't offer a third alternative in the end. I mean, he didn't. And that's why, ultimately, obviously it's a little more complex than that, but that's a big reason why Trump ended up in power. And I think that absolutely we should engage with people where they're at, but we can't just stay there. I think we need to always have in mind the necessity to raise people's horizons to the need for a socialist revolution. If you don't connect the problems of everyday life with the need for a radical, fundamental transformation of society, then you're just basically telling people what they already know. And I think you therefore need to raise things, as I would argue, in a transitional way. For example, a program that says we need free universal healthcare for everybody, also free universal education for everybody. We need, food for everybody, housing for everybody. But the system can't deliver. I mean, it just simply cannot deliver. It hasn't delivered in the last 200+ years that it's dominated the country and the planet, and it's not going to deliver anytime soon in the crisis that is passing through. So people will then realize, well, that's a very reasonable, simple demand. Why shouldn't the richest country on earth, which pays more for healthcare per capita than anyone else, not be able to afford it? Oh, it's because of the people that dominate the healthcare industry, the political parties that are fed and funded by that industry. I mean, that's what we've got to get people thinking about and raising that perspective. as far as what else you could do, I mean, I can imagine a cover of Jacobin magazine calling for the creation of a mass socialist party or a mass workers party or a labor party or whatever. I mean, that would make a big impact. I mean, I think a lot of people would be very interested in that.
We did it already.
Yeah,
you don't even know because it made no impact.
Well, I mean, is that the unifying theme of your publication? Not the issues that I've read in the last few years, definitely. So I mean, if you're open to that, I'd be very pleased to see that, and would make sure that people bought every copy of Jacobin that they could find, because I don't think you can equate propaganda with rhetoric. It's not just rhetoric. It's not just saying things over and over and hoping they eventually become true. The definition of propaganda is to give many ideas to a smaller number of people. We are a relatively small number of people now, as you just said. We aren't a mass movement yet. I agree. The socialist movement is very limited in terms of what a movement is. I mean, if you want to see what a movement is, look at the immigrant workers' struggle of 2005, 2006. That was an inspiring, real, genuine mass movement. We have yet to see something like that in socialism. But if you don't start, planting those seeds of those ideas, if you don't start with healthy, clear DNA, you're never going to build a strong, functioning organization in the future.
Thanks, John. So I'd like to hear just a brief 2-minute wrap up on this very wide discussion on where we're going and how to get there, and then we'll take some questions, and if there is any further thoughts from either of you right now, or we can move straight to questions.
Yeah, I think we can move to questions. I mean,
Okay.
the last thing I'll say is just we have the goal of socialists needs to be primarily to embed ourselves in the struggles of working people. And I think that is our common point of agreement. Obviously, we disagree on almost everything else, but I think that is an important point of agreement. And the reason why we say this isn't because workers are oppressed or because they're poor. The reason why we say this is because workers have disruptive power. You could politicize, like you mentioned before, politicize 30, 40,000 people, and in a struggle for not only this vague abstract thing, but also for something that affects their day-to-day life, because those things aren't in conflict when it comes to workers. And it could affect the lives of millions of other people, and it could create a disruptive effect in society as a whole. So that's our goal. I think it gets a lot more complicated when it comes to bringing it into practice. And when I think about my trajectory as a socialist over the course of 10, 11 years, I don't think the goal has changed. I don't think I've actually moved to the right on anything. I think what I have done, and what I think a lot of people around DSA, around Jacobin have done, is think about how to take abstract ideas and put them into practice. And obviously we're going to have lots of disagreements, but I think this is the value of conversations like this to try to get more and more concrete and actually engage with people and make socialism not this abstract thing, but something that they could they feel like belongs to them and doesn't just belong to the people who kind of found it first or who kept the flame alive during very, very dark years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think this has been a great start to what is the beginning of this discussion. I think that the question of clarifying what socialism is, what it isn't, where we're going, where we are not going, where we shouldn't go, where it would be very bad to go, I think is really important. I really appreciate the opportunity for us to have this exchange of ideas tonight, which is going to continue and is going to broaden and broaden over time, because I think ultimately, I agree absolutely, the working class is not stupid. The working class is going to ultimately make decisions that are in their best interests. However, they need to be given options for options that are actually going to change fundamentally their quality of life. And if we're not out there boldly through the lean years and the not so lean years, there'll be more lean years to come if we, until we have the social revolution. Then they're never going to know that those ideas exist, and they're going to have a limited horizon. That's why I think publications like Social Revolution and Jacobin have the possibility of reaching much wider audience than we could have just a few years ago. And I'd just like to finally say that I think that we have to always keep in mind that socialism is international or it's nothing. I mean, that's the other key component of socialism. You can't have socialism in one country. The United States, I would argue, however, is the best place for starting socialism in the sense that we have the economic potential here for transforming not just the quality of life of people in this country, but for changing the whole planet. And the responsibility that we socialists in the United States have is that if we liberate the United States from capitalism, then we will in effect liberate the whole of humanity from capitalism. Because who's going to invade socialist United States of America? And that's a perspective we have to fight for. It's not just about the United States; it's about the whole planet.
Thanks, guys. Thanks to our panelists. All right, I'm going to open it up for a few minutes for some questions and comments. So if you do want to be on the stack, just raise your hand. I already see a few people, and I'll put you on the stack, and we'll take a few at a time and allow for some response after that. So I saw you in the blue shirt there, and you. No, the gentleman in front of you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you too for the discussion that you've led. You're doing a great job. I particularly identify as a liberal socialist, and we lib socialists add a unique dynamic to the world of socialism. We in fact are not anti-capitalist. Why are we not? We're confident that it's possible to. We don't see capitalism as something that's etched in stone and something that is only going to benefit the right wing. We're confident that it can be molded according to leftist standards. And I personally would argue today that we don't live in a capitalist society. We live in a corporatist society. And why is it like that? It's because in a purely capitalist society, it's laissez-faire. The government stays out of business altogether. In the society we have, the government is getting involved in business, and they're playing for the wrong team. High society. In a world, in a liberal socialist world, there still would be capitalism because we allow some degree of private ownership, but there would be left-wing standards too because there would be a system in place to make sure that nobody gets exploited. Why do you feel that instead that capitalism should be destroyed altogether?
Thank you. John Apple, I have you next.
Oh, okay. My question is, what is the significance of building solidarity on the left and strategies to achieve it?
Thanks, John. Gray shirt there.
I guess my question is that recently we've seen a revival in some of the most reactionary thinkers on, really it's both the far right and the center trying to promote figures like Solzhenitsyn. You see people like Jordan Peterson doing that sort of thing. And I guess my question is, like, the socialist movement traditionally has been attacked for being undemocratic. Recently there's been a tendency to stress democracy particularly. But now what we're seeing is liberals especially treating this, we need to save democracy as like the highest value against Trump, and at the same time using that as an excuse to say, oh, well, the far left is a problem too. And I guess just ways to tackle that and like move beyond that and realize the limitations of bourgeois democracy. If you want to call it that.
Thank you. I'm going to take Jack next and then you then.
Similar sort of to the last question, but I guess, we're seeing the rise of like the far right and of fascism basically worldwide. And I guess I just have I see the point, Bhaskar, that you're making about the usefulness of using the current system to win reforms, but especially with something like climate change bearing down on us and capitalism's crises intensifying, do you worry that the organized far right offering a solution in that we should kill all non-whites to save humanity or whatever, will gain power among the capitalists faster than we can reform the system using, for example, the Democratic ballot line or the Republican ballot line or whatever?
Thanks, Jack. Bernice, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'm going to let you go, actually.
Okay, my question is that since the the boundary of the world is now geographical, so how U.S. socialism can connect itself to the rest of the world's movements?
Okay. Thanks. So I'm going to turn it over for some answers after those first five. I do have you two on the stack next.
So I would say for one thing, what you described with liberal socialism was, I don't mean this in a bad way, pejorative way. It's kind of just the right of social democracy and what they said. And this is actually, there's a book that I very much disagree with. You might agree with, and like Anthony Crosland, The Future of Socialism, is written in 1956, and it makes some of those arguments actually. So if you want to read it, you should, and then I'll send you some criticism of it. But even as late as early as the 1880s and 1890s, Bismarck was constructing a welfare state in Germany, and he was doing it at the same time he was banning the German Workers' Party, the SPD. And the SPD theorists, even when he was constructing the welfare state, pejoratively called it state socialism. And they knew that capitalism didn't have to be laissez-faire. And in fact, pure capitalism cannot be laissez-faire because the state is needed to create certain rules of the game, but also to make certain medium and long-term decisions individual capitalists find in their collective interests, but not in their individual interests. So for example, if I create this new product or new good, but I need to ship it somewhere, it doesn't make sense for me to invest in the port to ship the product out there because my competitor who would just take advantage of my port but not have to invest the resources to do it. So you always need the state to mediate it. I would say fundamentally my objection to socialism is my objection to the hierarchy and inequality that I think is inherent. My objection to capitalism is inherent in capitalism. So in other words, when we see inequities in society, that's the after effect of inequities built into the system. So inequality in itself of wealth, for example, isn't the problem. What I think is a problem is just the idea that we're in a society where only a small amount of people control the things that the rest of us need to survive. Back when we were peasants, right? I just had a plot of land. I could sow the land and I could get what I need to survive from the land. But today, if I want to find a job, if I need to work, I need to go to someone like you. Let's say if you own a business, I would need to go to you, and you'd be able to set the terms on which I'm working, right? And I think that condition of subordination would still exist in your vision of a good society. So that's why I don't think that's ideal. But of course, we need to in the short term. I'm sure there's plenty of immediate reforms that we would agree with. And the last, I'll kind of jump around. I could answer some that they weren't addressed, but I do think that there is a need for a independent ballot line at some point. I do think there's a need for a rupture from the Democratic Party at some point, and I think there's but in the medium term, I think we could cohere together a broader overarching kind of caucus or a party that's running both Democrats and independents and whatnot is able to give them more of a unified profile. If DSA's strategy is just what DSA is doing now, I think it falls into the trap of what you were mentioning before, is that it seems to people like, oh, these are just Democrats and we're just voting for Democrats, and I think that's going to be a problem as we move forward. But if you have an independent caucus, if you have a membership organization, in other words, in which everyone who's a member agrees to some like 10 broad principles, and every candidate who runs, who's a member, agrees to those principles, and they only get funding from that party or that organization or affiliated, rank and file unions and other movements. That to me is independent political action, even if they're running on a rival ballot line in a place where they can't secure ballot access easily. And that's a higher standard than what DSA candidates and others have been doing. But I think it's important. But also, that wouldn't just be creating a third party, that'd be creating the first party. In other words, in the United States, we don't actually have, in the sense you have in other countries, political parties, and that I became a registered Democrat when I got my driver's license when I was like 18 years old. And I became a registered Democrat because I lived in New York. And if you want to vote in competitive elections in New York, you have to vote in the Democratic primary. So I registered as a Democrat. Since then, I barely voted in Democratic primaries, but I've spent most of my existence attacking the Democratic Party and its leadership. I can never, ever be expelled from the Democratic Party for doing that. I could never be expelled from the Democratic Party for voting and supporting like Jill Stein like I did in the last election, and not the candidate of the Democratic Party for saying that the Democratic Party needs to be destroyed because they can't discipline you. And it's not a party in that sense. We need to create a membership party in which we can discipline our candidates and we can subject ourselves to discipline. That sounds like an ominous thing. All I mean is, like, if we say that we're an anti-racist party, if we say that we're a party about working class independence, and one of our candidates votes for a budget cut, or votes for something that'll end up with kind of anti-working class implications, that we could find a way to kick them out and to make sure that they're challenged in the next election. But I think ultimately the goal has to be an independent ballot line. The question is, though, how you get there, and that's where it's complicated, and we're just figuring it out as we go along. As far as the last question I'll answer is just around geographic divisions of wealth. I mean, I think that the best thing we could do in a lot of these countries in the global north is to just win reforms and win power. And it seems like, because capitalism isn't really a zero-sum game. It's not even a zero-sum game between countries. So why are Greek workers, for example, so screwed in the current Eurozone arrangement? Now, you would think because German workers are extracting stuff from Greek workers or whatever. It actually is kind of the opposite, if anything. Or opposite in the sense that German workers are in the arrangement in the last 20, 30 years getting paid less for productivity gains than they used to, because the German capitalist class has an export-oriented kind of model for growth. So what happens if German workers start going on strike and start demanding that whenever there's productivity gains in Germany, their wages increase? They're not able to dump cheap goods onto Greece in the Eurozone. So that kind of would help German workers potentially. It would help Greek workers. I mean, that's just an example, but I think there's a million of these things. So I reject the idea that workers in the global north are now or have ever been benefiting from the exploitation of workers in the global south. And that's a good thing if we, believe in solidarity. And obviously there's other measures that could be immediately done by even a center-left government that was pressured, like things like radical debt abolition of debt held in the third world, and so on. But fundamentally, a lot of our immediate demands are about keeping the U.S. out of military interventions abroad, and also doing these things like aid and debt abolition. But in general, the track record of even center-left governments in power have actually been not terrible on a lot of these issues. You could look at Sweden's record under Olof Palme, which was spotty on some issues, but on foreign policy, these are the leading forces fighting apartheid's South Africa and the global north, and so on and so on. The record is not terrible.
John?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. As far as libertarian socialism, would you call yourself? In any case, I mean, I appreciate your clear class instinct of anger, basically, against the rule of the rich in this country, and I think that that's a healthy instinct. But I think that if you think that you can have capitalism without exploitation, then that's just not how capitalism works. I mean, that's just how the beast functions. So I think we have to go beyond capitalism, and there's no solution within it. I think it is interesting, though, the point that you raised about state capitalism, as I think it would be fairly called, in the sense that the capitalist state will often take on certain expenses like railroads or infrastructure or highways or even schools or utilities and stuff like that, because the capitalist class as a whole requires these things, and yet they're not profitable. And so they'll actually pass the burden along to taxpayers who happen to be mostly working class people, anyways, as a form of subsidy to the capitalists who do need railroads and highways and stuff like that, not to mention the needs of the U.S. military to get around the country on the infrastructure, or the need to have at least in the past, a relatively educated working class in order to do the kind of work that they needed to remain competitive on a world market. So I think that it's absolutely clear that there is no such thing as a pure and perfect capitalism in that sense. And it is funny, Bismarck I believe, may have been the first to institute retirement plans, old age pension, which began at age 70, which of course at that time of human history was beyond the reach of pretty much anybody. Nobody lived, very few people lived to that age. So it was very generous of him to implement that. As far as the significance of solidarity, I mean, there's obviously the question of working class solidarity. I mentioned the PACTCO strike and the lack of solidarity there. International solidarity, I think, is crucial. And I think that's one of the key things that socialists need to be conscious of. And we have to remember that even though it's easy to get caught up in the politics and everything of this country, there's a lot of things going on around the world, a lot of struggles taking place around the world, and we have to be in solidarity with them. As far as the left as such having solidarity with each other, I think the approach that I would take is what I call a united front, which is where, if we agree on a certain issue, for example, we want to end the war in Iraq or whatever, when that war began or whatever, we would march together, as you say, we'd march separately rather, and strike together against that particular problem. But we would march separately, maintain our own identities, our own demands, our own criticisms of other people in that broader group, and we would come together on that particular issue, which is of broader interest to the working class. That's very different from what I would call a popular front, where you have the sort of the unity of the people, where you have, i.e. people of all classes coming together allegedly to fight, for something. But what always happens is that the ruling class will get the upper hand in these popular fronts. And I think the danger of supporting the Democrats, for example, in any way, shape, or form, is that you're breeding illusions in that. I think that there's definitely, I think it was a very important point about the revival of the far right, or at least the public revival of these people, I would say of fascists versus fascism. I don't think fascism as such is there, but there's definitely, high school, classes now doing Nazi salutes and stuff like that. But I think that we have to expect that. The polarization in society, the interest in the left, the interest in socialism is going to also be reflected in people moving towards the right. That polarization has two poles, hence the name. And I think we shouldn't be surprised by it. However, we should understand that if we don't give a solution on the left, if the working class doesn't give a viable solution to the mass of the population, that things are going to get uglier and uglier and uglier as far as that goes in the next period. Also, a very important point was raised about climate change. And I think that's something that's on a lot of people's minds. I mean, the weather that we've been living through, around the planet lately has been pretty nuts, including today. A bit early maybe for a storm like that. But the problem with climate change is that if we want to control the impact that humans have on the climate, then we have to have an impact on the aspects of human society that are having that impact. And that is the means of production, the factories, the way that land is used, the way that fertilizers are used, the way that food is raised, etc. But you can't have a plan. You can't have a rational plan for the economy. You can't have a democratically controlled economy, i.e. with the democratic input of the majority of the population, which is what I'm in favor. I think socialism has to include the nationalization of the key levers of the economy to be run under democratic workers' control. You can't plan something that you don't control, and you can't control something that you don't own. And the problem is the capitalists will say, well, it's my factory, it's my fields, it's my fertilizer, I own it. Bourgeois liberal property rights, confer upon me the right to dispense with these things the way I wish. You can complain all you want, but this piece of paper says it's mine, and therefore I'm going to do what I want with it. Revolutionary socialists would argue that piece of paper is less important than the future of humanity, and therefore we might have to go beyond the limits of that piece of paper and make sure that we own and control and therefore plan the economy. And as far as the geographical divisions of wealth, I mean, I think that there's no objective reason for any country on the planet to be poor, for any people on the planet to be poor. I think we should abolish borders. Obviously, there's rivers and mountains and things like that we can negotiate, we can get around with human ingenuity, but there's absolutely no reason why some parts of the planet should be poor and others not. And I think that we can have a harmonious world socialist federation, like I said. And just finally, if I have this 30 more seconds on the question of Greece, I mean, I think there's another very important example of the question of a need for leadership. Back when the struggle over the future of Greece reached its high point, you had the entire Greek population, or a huge majority of the population, in favor of giving, the middle finger to the Troika, who wanted to impose all these onerous conditions and austerity on the Greek people. And they voted, in effect, in a referendum to reject those conditions and to give authority to Tsipras to reject them, and they would have backed them. They would have supported it. There could have been an international appeal to the German working class, to the Spanish working class, to the Italians, the French, Portugal, all the countries in Europe, Ireland, that are suffering similar problems, and instead Tsipras, again, he had a golden moment. I mean, watch videos of what was happening in Syntagma Square on the night of that referendum victory, and don't tell me that the working class wasn't ready to fight to the end. If only he had lifted his little finger and had the courage to do that, instead of basically accepting, I mean, it wasn't quite this crude, but a Swiss villa somewhere in Switzerland. So again, the question of leadership, I think, is crucial, and that was another missed opportunity, which could have changed the whole course, not only of European history, but of world history.
Thanks, guys. If you raised your hand in the first round, I haven't gotten you yet. Please raise it again. I got you too. Got X, Stan. Okay. So we'll start with the gray sweater and then you.
Right. So as the media Overton window has been shifting right since before I can even remember, ironically, it seems like the best media messaging for leftist platforms has been on Fox News infographics on AOC. So John, I think you mentioned that consciousness kind of lags behind society. So how do we get leftist messaging into the mainstream media, into these gigantic neoliberal monoliths?
Thank you.
I just kind of, especially for Bhaskar, I want to hear kind of like a reflection on past 2018 elections and also like DSA's electoral victories. So just a reflection on that, and of course from John.
Gabe?
I was going to bring up the subject of climate change again, because like climate scientists give us kind of a timeline of how much time we actually have before like some serious irreparable damages are done, like rising seas causing climate refugees and water shortages all over. And with these scarcities of resources, I think that's what'll bring about like the Green New Deal, which is what climate reformers now are trying to call for. With a lot of Democrats, they're all orienting behind the Green New Deal, and I think if we want to bring a lot of climate reformists onto like a socialist platform rather than organizing with the Democrats, I think we need to offer like a practical solution that's comparable to the Green New Deal, that rather than just saving capitalism and mitigating the problems of climate change, like there needs to be an answer, like a labor party that they can organize with. And just like what are some of the challenges right now of creating a labor party? Because like once we hit 2030, a lot of these problems are going to just I feel like big capitalism deeper entrenched, and it'll be harder to challenge.
Thanks, Gabe. Next, I'm going to go to X.
Okay. I have a question on something that I've thought about and arrived at some thoughts, but I also want to hear how both of you would address this. Actually, it's probably like I guess it's more directly in response to something that you, Bhaskar, said. You mentioned something about how with even a center-left government, social democratic government, and pressure it from below, that it would be able to give concessions. And I'm wondering I haven't seen that happen concretely in the last period. It could happen in theory, but I haven't seen in concrete occasions that they were in that situation, that's the choice they made. So how would you explain that? How would you offer a different version of it or a different solution or not? And obviously, John, I could also hear your thoughts on
Thanks. And Stanton, you'll be the last.
Thank you. Yeah, so the concept of bourgeois democracy was mentioned in, I think, when you were answering the first question. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what exactly bourgeois democracy is, and in particular for Mr. Sunkara, if the political system we live under isn't bourgeois democracy, then what is the political system we live under?
Right. If you want me to,
Go ahead,
yep.
please.
So I'll take it just in reverse order. So all I'm saying is that the bourgeoisie had nothing to do with the creation of democracy. They fought against it tooth and nail. So we live in a capitalist society that has been tempered by the workers' movement. Even here, even in the United States, we don't live in the worst of all possible worlds. We live in a 3.5 out of 10. It's not great, but it could be worse. And I think that's important to remember, because if you tell people that, things are the worst that they could possibly be, then, obviously they feel no possibility that things can get better, or that struggles can consciously change things. And over the course of the 20th century, and the history of the American left as a whole, has actually been a pretty admirable history. We've been ineffective, but we've also been at the forefront of a lot of breakthroughs. Socialists were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. We're at the forefront of mass unionization. We fought for universal suffrage. The first left was the abolitionist movement, and that's a left that led the only real revolution in American history, and the only real, as you mentioned, revolutionary party, that great Republican Party. So I guess I don't think the concept of bourgeois democracy means anything. If you mean to say parliamentary democracies within a capitalist society, and that's a shorthand for that, sure. But I think it confuses people, because they think that means that the democracy that we have, in which we can exert some influence, was just randomly gifted to us by our class enemies, which just doesn't make sense. It's not what happened historically. I would say, sorry, I forgot your name, but you brought up a interesting question, which is that you're right. The center-left parties of Europe and elsewhere in the West haven't actually been able to deliver rounds of reforms like they did in the past. The period of mass reforms was actually pretty limited to a window of the immediate post-war period until the mid-1970s. And since then, whenever they got into power, it's been kind of the managing austerity with a human face, right? We're going to make cuts slower or in a different way, but still basically the same effect. And I think that is relevant in that at the level of temporality, I think that there is going to be a period in which a left government is administering the capitalist state, but trying to do so in the interests of workers. And this is going to create all sorts of tensions and pressure. I don't think there could be a prolonged period of positive leftward-moving governance like there was in the immediate post-war period, which means that I think the cycle will be a lot shorter. So whereas a lot of these parties took power, like the Swedish SAP took power for their period of almost uninterrupted rule in the mid-1930s. Then social democracy built the welfare state and built their model. Then social democracy radicalized starting in the late 1960s. And then the big battles happened in the 70s. Then the project kind of collapsed by the early 80s. I think that cycle will happen, but a lot quicker in the matter of years. And I think there's lots of structural reasons for it. And yeah, I mean, if I knew how to get, that's the goal of one of the goals of Jacobin, right? To penetrate a wider conversation and to bring social ideas to as many people as possible in as accessible a way as possible. So if you have ideas, please let me know. I think that part of being on the left, though, has to be speaking at least some of the enemy's language, just at the level of, if Vox is going to do a policy related breakdown of why they think single payer can't work in the United States, we need to have people who are able to construct graphs and look at the data and counter them at the policy level, even if we prefer talking about politics and the conditions in which policy is written rather than policy itself. And I think things like that and developing expertise with even things like presentation is really important on the left. So Jackman is really good design. Design is not right wing or left wing. It's just design. It's either looks shit or it doesn't. To people, either it's comprehensive. Same thing with accounting. I was at a conference. I didn't go to the thing, but it was like something about like left wing, like accounting for like left wing, like movement accounting or something. I was like, I don't actually know what was said, but what could that possibly mean? Either the numbers fucking add up or it doesn't. You don't need to go to Allied Media Conference, I don't know. Get a calculator. So anyway, that's my answer.
No, I think these are very important questions. I think when we look at the media today, it's very clear that it's not going to let us get in there with our ideas. I mean, we might get invited to some right-wing Fox News host show so they could try to ridicule us or make us look silly. I think we would obviously jump at the opportunity to do something like that. For example, if Tucker Carlson wanted us to go on his show, which they actually did contact us once to go on there, but the timing didn't work out in the end on their end. We would have done that, but it's very rare opportunities. I mean, so we've got to explain to people what real, genuine democratic press would look like. And we think that one of the demands in our program is that allocation to media resources, whether it's television production, equipment or studios or radio, transmission facilities or printing presses, whatever, should be allocated democratically on the basis of the kind of support that these organizations or parties or viewpoints have within society. So if you have, for example, 30% of Americans are in favor of socialism, so they say they should let us have 30% of the television airtime and the newsprint and the magazines and everything. Of course, that's not going to happen because about 6 people control the media in this country because we live under not a workers' democracy, but a bourgeois democracy. So I think ultimately it's going to be a molecular process of these ideas being transmitted through magazines, through word of mouth, through social media. But ideas, they can be carried in a wide range of ways, above all, by going from one person talking to someone else. So I think that's not going to stop them. I mean, in countries like, for example, Egypt, where the media was completely controlled by Mubarak. I mean, in the middle of the revolution, they showed stock footage of the streets of Cairo. All is calm, everything's great, nothing to see here. When in reality, you had millions of people on the streets. Even that control of the media is not going to be enough to stop the working class from moving once it actually moves into action. And it's true. We sometimes joke that you can't set the date for the revolution. People say, oh, when's the working class going to move into action? Well, the working class will move into action when it decides collectively that it's going to do it. We can't set the date for the revolution, but nature may very well impose a deadline, a time limit on us. If we don't make that transformation of society, it may be too late for us to move things forward. We might just be playing a losing game if we reach that tipping point in terms of climate. But I think the main thing is that even if we do reach that tipping point, there's no way that we're going to be able to ameliorate the effects of climate change if we don't have control over the economy. I mean, I talked earlier about taking over the economy, under public ownership to be run democratically. I would be satisfied with, the top 500, give or take, companies in this country, because the top 500 companies, they account for about 70% or more of GDP. They dominate the economy. And if you have workers control, democratic public ownership over those entities, you're going to have a lot of say in what happens. So, I mean, there's literally millions and millions and millions of companies in this country. An Avon seller is considered a company, but we're talking about just 500 of those, a tiny percentage, which happen to be the most important ones. So I don't think what we need is a new Green Deal, in the sense that the original New Deal was actually a tool by the capitalists, by a very clever Democrat, FDR, to stave off socialist revolution by giving a few crumbs to people, and therefore it saved capitalism. I think we need a socialist revolution that is going to actually seize the means of production in order to actually allow us to plan an economy that can stave off. And eventually, I believe, we can reverse the effects of climate change, or at the very least make sure that people aren't drowned or die of lack of water and so on as we go through this process. As far as bourgeois democracy, yeah, I mean, we do live in a bourgeois democracy. I mean, it's absolutely true. The working class had to claw and fight its way for any kind of a vote, of a franchise for different layers of the population. But I would say that, with the founding of this country, with the U.S. Constitution, the bourgeois gave themselves the franchise, and in that sense, it's a bourgeois democracy. But that's very different from working class democracy, which is what I'm in favor of. And I would say that the American Civil War, I would consider it the second American Revolution. I think it's one of the most incredible events in human history. But I would also argue that despite the result of the American Revolution, which ended up with the rule of a small handful of wealthy property owners, plantation owners, and the like, it was a mass revolution where you had the entry of all kinds of ordinary people into the scene of history. You ended up with the biggest political exodus, I think, in human history, with the Tories running away to Canada and England, and a huge expropriation of private property, privately owned land, huge landed estates. And you have things like Shays' Rebellion, which took place after the revolution, which I think were also very, very significant. So.
I just want to. Well, first of all, this is the one thing where I'm actually an ultra leftist on the American Revolution. No quarters to the laborers' rebellion. I think we all would have been better off without it. But anyway, I was gonna just wrap up and say thank you for the invitation. On that note, I appreciate it. I actually just landed in the U.S. Around midnight. And then it took me 4 hours to get here, but I feel so rejuvenated now. And thanks a lot for coming, despite the weather. And I hope you're able to get home safely.
Yes, everyone. I hope we get home safely as well. And thank everybody here at Temple and all the different clubs that helped organize this. I know for a fact that there's people who have been watching this around the world. It's been live streamed. And I believe a video recording will be made available as well. So we can continue this dialogue, this clarification of ideas. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you, comrades.
Appreciate it.